There are all sorts of reasons to doubt the existence of a perfectly loving God, but one of the most powerful is the problem of divine hiddenness. Now, there's more than one way to cash this out. But when people refer to or defend the hiddenness argument, they're almost always interested in discussing the problem as articulated by philosopher J.L. Schellenberg. Though his argument is very precisely communicated, there seems to be no end to misunderstanding. Believers often take whatever concept of hiddenness they want to talk about and inject it into these conversations, as if that should function as a refutation. No. So in the spirit of rebuke and correction, I'm going to help explain this as clearly as I can. If you're familiar with my content, then you know that I can go back and forth between interviewing scholars and making fun of sermons. This particular video is going to be a bit more serious and a little technical, but I promise that if you stick around, I'm going to make it simple once we plow through the weeds. Here's how the argument is summarized in a major book on the topic. 1. If a perfectly loving God exists, then there exists a God who is always open to a personal relationship with any finite person. 2. If there exists a God who is always open to a personal relationship with any finite person, then no finite person is ever non-resistantly in a state of non-belief in relation to the proposition that God exists. 3. If a perfectly loving God exists, then no finite person is ever non-resistantly in a state of non-belief in relation to the proposition that God exists. 4. Some finite persons are or have been non-resistantly in a state of non-belief in relation to the proposition that God exists. 5. No perfectly loving God exists. 6. If no perfectly loving God exists, then God does not exist. 7. God does not exist. Well, that's certainly a mouthful. Well, here's Shellenberg defending a simpler version of the argument.
Think about 3 scenarios. God exists, and there are no non-believers. That is, God exists, and perhaps there are other people too, and if there are, all of them believe that God exists. The second scenario is one in which God exists, and not everybody is a believer. There are some people who believe, some people who don't believe, but all of those who don't believe fail to believe because they're resisting God in some way. And so all of the non-belief in the world in the second scenario is resistant non-belief. And now the third scenario is one in which God exists, and some people believe in God, some people don't believe in God, with the added wrinkle now that of those who don't believe in God, some are resistant, but some are not. And now you can take the central claim of the argument as saying something like this: the first 2 scenarios are possible if God exists, and the third is impossible. So if God exists, there are no non-resistant non-believers. The second premise, perhaps obviously, is going to be, yeah, there are non-resistant non-believers, from which the conclusion follows there's no God.
And here's Ben Watkins of Real Atheology painting an even fuller picture.
One of those bad things is that there are people like me, people who are non-resistant non-theists, people who are open to a relationship with God, and who are not in any, their non-theism is not in any way part of an emotional opposition towards God. They're open to finding a higher power and having a relationship with it. So former believers like me are one example of a non-theist. An isolated non-theist, someone like an Amazonian tribesman, would be a non-theist, a non-resistant non-theist. A lifelong seeker, someone who spent their life trying to find God but never accomplished that, or someone who converted to a non-theistic tradition. These are all non-resistant non-theists. And that this is surprising, that this observation can actually entail that there is no perfectly loving being. Because if we start with the idea of a perfectly loving being, and to use an analogy, a perfectly loving parent, the idea is that perfectly loving God would always be open to relationship with every finite person. Just like a perfectly loving parent would always be open to relationship with their child. They would ensure that nothing they did put relationship out of reach. Now, they might let their child or creation go and do whatever they want but nothing they do will put the relationship out of reach. They will, for them, always be like a light that remains on unless they close their eyes. And so always being open to relationship means that everyone believes God exists unless they're somehow resisting it. Because in order to have a loving relationship with someone, you have to believe that they exist.
Right.
That's just a necessary condition of having a meaningful relationship with someone. I can't have a meaningful relationship with someone unless I believe they exist. And since I don't believe that they exist, and that opposition is not some resistance on my part, it's not me closing my eyes to the light, that fact entails that there is no being that is always open to relationship with us. And if there's no being that's always open to relationship with us, there is no perfectly loving being. And if there is no perfectly loving being, there is no God.
Right.
That's the argument from Hiddenness.
The main idea here is this. Many theists claim that God is perfectly loving, or even that God is love. But when we look around at the world, we see people who would be open to a relationship with God if they thought he was there, and even people who want God to exist but just don't find themselves believing that he does. Now, of course, there are outs for theists to take. Maybe everyone knows God exists deep down. Despite the appearances to the contrary, every non-theist who has ever lived over the course of human history was really just suppressing the truth. Or maybe it's possible to be in a relationship with God without knowing it. Or maybe there are hidden reasons for hiddenness. God works in mysterious ways after all, so there might be some set of unintuitive reasons that perfect love can look like absence. Whatever response you happen to give, please spare us of your elementary misunderstandings. Stop equivocating on terms when they're clearly defined within the context of the argument. It just gets embarrassing at a certain point.